Marvel Zombies takes us into a universe where the world is infected by zombies, and Kamala and her unlikely band of heroes must team up together in order to stop the Queen of the Dead before everything's too late. Hello and welcome Cinema, where we focus on the film. I'm Jess, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the Marvel Zombie series. Was it good, was it bad, or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review to decide if you're going to see it or not, and taking it right in a positive. Marvel Zombies is eccentric within the way that it's bloodthirsty, within the way it's going about its narrative. It's very similar and reminiscent to What If Season 1, Episode 5, that own solo spin-off movie that was going about its own means, that this extends itself into containing that same story but carrying on multiple different perspectives, starting off with Kamala Khan and Riri, and what we're following with certain characters from TV shows, where this show really expands onto characters we haven't seen in a while, or we just haven't gotten quite enough of, such as Shang-Chi, Doctor Strange, and whatnot, and going about the way formulating all those character groups along the way, it creates an atmosphere that's very different than what you expect out of this form of show. But of course, it's bloody and going all over the place with some of the kills, which is what you may be wanting to go in to deserve. There is the talking zombies that makes it different than the What If episode, but it still makes sense to the standard of developing a story where the villains, as the zombies, have this own form of communication that makes sense to the natural ideas and the connection between villain versus hero. The way we're following about that, the animation looks great throughout. It's slightly different than what we've seen from other shows, but it still follows along with a great atmosphere, a good standards to what you can expect out of the story, tacking on some other villains, some anti-heroes along the way, creating some great elements that really amp up the story as a whole, which goes about a relatively good pace with good ideas that are just flowing on throughout with what you're taking on, with things that are similar and reminiscent to what we got out of the original What If episode, and being able to connect that with this show as a whole is something that's really good, and I would have expected that to be the standard, and it sufficiently builds off of that once you get into episode 3, but still following along with what this show is, it separates itself even from the What If series kind of on its own terms until it reaches those marks where we get Peter Parker, Ant-Man, the aftermath of that What If episode, that still brings about a satisfaction of a conclusion to some standards along the way. Which takes me into the mix on falling about with this story. There's a passive viewing that I personally got out of it. I wasn't fully blown away from all of this things. I wasn't fully emotionally attached to some of these characters because of the way things are a little bit odd and randomized at times. You're having to separate the main Avengers we know and love. Yes, you're getting a lot of great moments, particularly with Thor and other key characters that we've seen before many times. But this is a way to refresh what we're learning about some of the characters. But another thing to note is that this takes place in another universe. So if it sort of bothers you that some of the stakes are set lower than what you would want it to be, well, there is a lot of consequences. There's deaths falling about along the way. This isn't as consequential as what the main multiverse is within the universe we're following along within the movies and some key shows, that unfortunately just makes you less attached to these form of characters because you have to get to know them once again with a new formula, with a new connection between these different characters that ultimately could separate you from what all is going on with the story as a whole because of the way they distinguish some of the characteristics, some of the powers, the reality behind who knows who and how the teams are separated as a whole, it can feel just a little random at times, which is little offbeat to the natural longevity of how this story flows on throughout. While there is some good pacing to the standards that you come to expect, there's ultimately some aspects of the show that can drag along, even if it doesn't feel too long, feeling like something where things are a little bit out of place along the way. And taking it into the negatives, adding on to what I mentioned within this previous segment, what we get out of this show, there's certain things that just feel anticlimactic here and there. It's a few moments here and there, not the entire thing, not devastating, but it's things that can detract from the whole experience following through. What we get out of certain things that is relatively predictable, a little bit by the numbers when certain characters die, certain things and emotional characters are added in order to create an emotional attachment, but it feels artificial in some ways because you're not developing the characters throughout this movie in a proficient way that I feel connected to these versions, that the world is held at the stakes that it needs to, and that the consequences from this movie matters, because ultimately it just feels disconnected and you're not getting to relearn about all these new characters, these connections between them. It's a little rushed at times, and having to add in a new group of characters within episode 1, 2, and 3, and a little bit more within 4, concluding where this goes on to, it's just becoming interesting by the dynamics of these characters, but doesn't offer quite enough for me to formally know and be able to enjoy what this dynamic of a character group does, because there's ultimately some banter, but a few things that have to be rushed in order for them to get together, be able to cooperate in a way that's a bit quicker than you would expect out of the movie and the standards that you would know out of reality, because of the way they have to go on to the main problems that people are going to watch this show for, is for the action and for the bloodfest, that while that part can deliver, it just feels a little anticlimactic in some ways when you're not so emotionally attached to how they develop the characters leading on to that particular point. So the way they intertwine the development of the characters and the action as a whole just does not cross quite as well as I would hope for, which also leads me into another point where the conclusion to this season, that I won't spoil, of course, as I haven't spoiled anything, just leads on to something that I'm not a huge fan of. I don't know if it'll be controversial. People love it or hate it, depending on how you're going about it. But I felt like there could have been a better way of capping this off, making it feel more final and not feel a little reminiscent to something we've seen before within another story within the MCU twice. And so going about that is just a little repetitive, and also something that was a little safe within its ending, especially looking at all the emotional ties you led up to. And I feel like it's only setting up for a season 2 that will conclude that. But ultimately, I feel like if they were going with that route, it would have been better to go the Netflix strategy, releasing this as a part 1, and then a few months later or a few days later, whichever, they would release part 2, that you would be able to get to watch the second half of the show, that would ultimately make sense with how they concluded this show as a whole. So that's just my personal thoughts on Marvel Zombie series, which I have to rate a simply 7 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Marvel Zombies. Was it good? Was it bad? Or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review and now going to decide if you're going to see it or not, make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you haven't already to join the Film Culture community where we talk about the love cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.